nasty winter storm sets off a tragic chain of events.
Basically, this plane just fell out of the sky.
I said, we're in deep trouble, and waited for things to crash.
A jetliner with 79 people on board slams into a bridge
By the time they hit the bridge, they were out of options.
and crashes into the icy Potomac River.
There was a lot of fiberglass and metal. Jet fuel was everywhere.
6 people emerge from the wreckage. Rescuers spring into action.
I just kept yelling to them, hold on, I'm coming.
I take my boots off and my coat and just dove in the water.
On this episode of When Weather Changed History, the crash of Air Florida Flight 90. What caused it to fall out of the sky? And how this deadly accident was a wake-up call.
This was one of the events that changed aviation history.
Washington, D.C., the morning of January 13th, 1982. Snowfall shrouds familiar landmarks, and traffic grinds to a halt in a city accustomed to mild winters.
Washington doesn't react well to snowstorms. It's sort of famous for folding. And it was very heavy snow, and it was coming down rapidly.
Fast enough to shut down much of the nation's capital. Many offices close, so do schools, and flights are delayed. The blustery storm has all the markings of a nor'easter.
A nor'easter is a storm that generally moves up the coast, and its counterclockwise circulation produces northeast winds, and that's why it's called a nor'easter. Usually gives you a ton of moisture. You get to draw moisture from the Gulf of Mexico and from the Atlantic.
The nor'easter comes on top of a deep freeze. For 2 weeks, it has been bitterly cold. A sheet of ice blankets the Potomac River. Government employee Lenny Skutnik carpools into work that day.
We'd head across the 14th Street Bridge and up close to Capitol Hill where I work. Going across the river in the morning, the river was just solid white. You know, it was frozen over.
Telephone executive Joe Stiley and his assistant Nikki Felch are scheduled to go on a business trip to Florida. They leave their office late that morning and head to Washington National Airport.
That's about a 25, 30-minute drive typically, and it probably took us about twice as long as normal because of the weather. And it was continuing to accumulate.
For Stiley, this is an eventful day for another reason. It is his son's 12th birthday. When Stiley and his assistant reach the airport, their flight is already delayed.
We went into the cafeteria and had a cup of coffee and occasionally came out to see what, if anything, new was going on as far as weather and forecasts for the airport.
It's the kind of delay that's become more and more common. Airports across the country were busier than ever in the early 80s. The airlines had recently been deregulated. That meant more flights and fierce competition. Small carriers, such as Miami-based Air Florida, offer low fares and fly to new places.
Air Florida grew quickly from being a restricted airline confined to a certain space to one that could fly to any cities that it wanted to fly to.
Joe Stiley and his assistant Nikki Felch are scheduled to depart at 2:15 p.m. on Air Florida Flight 90 to Fort Lauderdale. 1:29 p.m. An Air Florida Boeing 737 arrives from Miami and taxis to Gate 12, where it will be quickly reserviced for the return flight to Florida. A passenger waiting at the airport snaps this photo of the Air Florida jet as it sits at the gate. The twin-engine jetliner is one of Boeing's most popular aircraft.
The 737 was a cash cow for Boeing. It's been a very successful airplane.
It's a very effective aircraft, easy to use on a short haul, comfortable, 3-in-3 seating is the typical configuration, and carries a relatively small load.
It's a very reliable airplane. It's a very easy airplane to fly. It's very robust in the sense of its structure.
This particular jet has logged more than 23,000 flight hours. But for an aircraft, it is not considered old. Although the airplane is built to withstand extreme conditions, its Miami-based crew has little experience flying in snowstorms. The most senior of the crew is 34-year-old Captain Larry Wheaton. He has flown with Air Florida since 1978, but logged only 8 flights in bad winter weather. His first officer, 31-year-old Roger Pettit, has flown just twice in snowy weather. After they land in Washington, the weather worsens.
Temperature fell as the snow got a little heavier. We're snowing around the rate of an inch an hour.
The ground crews at the airport have trouble battling the storm and need to clear the runways. 1:38 p.m. 9 minutes after the Air Florida plane lands, the airport shuts down the runways so crews can plow and sand them. There are 3 runways at Washington National, but only one is long enough to handle commercial aircraft. It is still relatively short at just under 7,000 feet. The airport is surrounded on 3 sides by the Potomac River.
There's water on both ends of the major runways. The airport is very constrained because of the proximity to the water.
2 p.m. The airport has been closed for 20 minutes, but airport officials hope to have the runways clear within a half hour. So the Air Florida crew begins to board passengers. From the terminal, Joe Stiley has been keeping an eye on the plane. Now, as he boards the jet, a flicker of concern crosses his mind.
I looked out at the aircraft, and I noticed that it still never had anybody do a walk around. There had been no pilots walk around that airplane, and there was snow and ice all over it. I thought that was curious, and I commented on it because I was a flight instructor and I used to notice these things and teach these things to people.
74 passengers take their seats. Joe Stiley and his assistant, Nikki Felch, sit in the back in the smoking section.
We sat in seats 18C, which was an aisle seat that I was in, and 18A, which was a window seat that Nikki was in, and it was hot inside that airplane. So I unpeeled my suit coat. I think I probably took off my necktie, and I put those up into the baggage compartment above my head.
Outside, a ground crew begins to de-ice the plane.
You spray a solution, I mean, just a big hose is what it is with a very strong surge force. And you spray the wings and the fuselage with a solution that is supposed to remove the ice from the aircraft.
But as they de-ice, the storm intensifies.
This produced a pretty good amount of snow in a relatively short time, about 10 to 12 hours.
2:30 p.m. Air traffic controllers informed the crew of Flight 90 that the bad weather is still preventing them from reopening the airport. So the Air Florida captain calls off the de-icing. The crew and passengers sit and wait in the plane, still at the gate. Outside, the temperature hovers around 24 degrees, and snow continues to fall on the airport. Coming up next on When Weather Changed History. As the plane prepares for takeoff, a few passengers realize something is not right.
There was so much slush on the windows on both sides that you really couldn't see out of the airplane.
January 13th, 1982, 2:30 p.m. A heavy snow has grounded flights at Washington National Airport. Among them is Air Florida Flight 90, bound for Fort Lauderdale. It sits at the gate. The pilot calls a stop to the de-icing of his aircraft until the runway is reopened. The snow and cold temperatures are caused by a nor'easter.
when you have a nor'easter, what'll happen is the temperature will actually fall during the day. So the temperature fell as the snow got a little heavier in the mid to late afternoon.
In response to the storm, many government offices and businesses close, and the evening rush hour gets off to an early start. Among the commuters is Roger Olean, a sheet metal worker at St. Elizabeth's Hospital. Before getting on the road, Olean calls his wife and tells her she too should leave work and go home early.
I advised her, I said, look, if they don't let you out pretty soon, just go home, because this is getting really, really bad, and if you don't leave soon, you're going to be spending hours and hours on the road.
Congressional Budget Office employee Lenny Skutnik also leaves work and soon gets stuck in traffic.
The federal government shut down, and we left early. And I was riding in a carpool. And we left the building probably 2:30 and didn't make it to the 14th Street Bridge until right around 4 o'clock.
One government office, the U.S. Park Police, does stay open. But Chief Helicopter Pilot Don Usher and rescue technician Gene Windsor assume they too will go home.
Don and I decided that we weren't flying that day because of the weather. That it was still snowing was taken into account as being very dangerous for us. And it was snowing hard.
It was about as lousy as you could get for a helicopter, a very, very snowy day. It was pretty miserable, low ceilings, bad visibility. We decided to hang on for a while, at least get through rush hour and see what the snow did.
2:45 p.m. at Washington National Airport. The runway is plowed and sanded, so air traffic controllers announce that flights will resume. The captain of Air Florida Flight 90 asks the ground crew to restart the de-icing of his aircraft. When the runway was first closed, ground crews had sprayed a mixture of heated water and ethylene glycol on half of the plane. Now the crews start all over, spraying the Boeing 737 with the de-icing solution. Once the wings are clear, the solution helps keep falling snow from sticking to the plane.
The de-icing process is relatively simple and straightforward. It's the heat that starts breaking up the process, and the force of the spray blows the residual ice and snow off the wing.
The weather on this day is so nasty that passenger Joe Stiley can barely see out the windows of the plane, even after the pilot ordered the de-icing.
By the time he had cleaned it up, you could see out one window, but by the time he cleaned up the other side, the first window had fogged back up and was kind of slushy again.
By 3:15 p.m., the de-icing is completed, but the de-icing fluid left the ground slick, so there's not enough traction for the plane to pull away from the gate. The pilot uses the plane's reverse thrusts to try to back out.
Essentially, you can put the plane in reverse and back it out of the gate. It is not a particularly unusual procedure for an airplane to try and back out by going into reverse thrust. I mean, it's certainly been done.
The crew did put the engines in reverse at the gate, which is permissible under some situation. They shouldn't have done it with the ice and snow.
Passenger Joe Stiley is a seasoned traveler who also has a pilot's license and is aware of the potential danger.
What I was curious about was how much snow and ice was he sucking into those engines and the process.
That may have thrown more ice and snow onto the aircraft. This obviously was an ice and snow issue.
But even the reverse thrust doesn't move the plane. Finally, an airport tug is able to push the plane back from the gate. The 737 taxis toward the runway and gets in line for takeoff.
It's inevitable the lines build up, particularly during rush hours. And in a storm like this, sure, there was a backup. Now, the backup then, the longer it gets, the longer it has been since you've been visited by the de-icing truck.
3:38 p.m. It's been more than a half hour since the plane was de-iced. The Air Florida jet is 16th in line for takeoff, and the snow is still coming down hard.
I mean, it was snowing like the very devil. I mean, there isn't any question about that. And it was coming down fast, and it was sticking, it was sub-freezing. This was a big deal snowstorm.
Flight 90 is now almost an hour and a half behind schedule. If the pilots go back to get another de-icing treatment, they will lose their place in line for takeoff. They decide not to go back for additional de-icing. They pull up close behind the plane in front of them.
The assumption being that the warm air from the engines would tend to de-ice the airplane or keep it from icing up. It's a pretty false assumption in the sense that the heat from the engine may melt the ice or turn it to liquid, and it may freeze again as soon as the heat comes off.
3:59 p.m. The Air Florida jet makes it to the front of the line.
They sat for 50 minutes with ice accumulating on the airplane.
As the airplane sits, the temperature remains a sub-freezing 24 degrees.
That becomes critical for some of the chemicals that are used to de-ice the wings. And they sat back on the tarmacs and the ice built back up again.
Snow was continuing to perhaps gather on the aircraft, on the wings, on the fuselage, and snow and ice on wings and fuselage significantly degrade the ability of a plane to take off.
Air Florida Flight 90, with the call sign Palm 90, gets the all clear from the control tower.
Palm 90, clear for takeoff. Palm 90, clear for takeoff.
The jet lumbers down the runway. For passenger Joe Stiley, it doesn't feel right. The plane is moving far too slowly, and he is now certain something is horribly wrong.
I became alarmed almost immediately. I felt like we were maybe half the speed that we might normally be. And it was bumpy. I expected the guy to pull off his throttles and abort the takeoff. It didn't happen, and I said, we're in deep trouble.
Coming up next on When Weather Changed History, the plane struggles to take off, and Joe Stiley prepares for the worst.
I put my head down between my knees and put my arms up around my head and my ears and waited for things to crash.
January 13th, 1982, Washington, D.C. After a series of delays due to bad weather, Air Florida Flight 90 is finally taking off. But it's covered with snow and ice and struggles to gain speed.
I thought we were going to actually go off the end of the runway and never get airborne. I put my head down between my knees and put my arms up around my head and my ears and waited for things to crash.
Normally, a plane becomes airborne within 30 seconds. On this flight, it takes nearly 45 seconds.
And they went farther down the runway, down a short runway, and they should have gone before they had enough thrust to try and pull the aircraft off the ground.
We did get airborne, and then so I lifted my head and I looked out the window.
Stiley sees the plane is flying dangerously low over the river.
But the ice on the wings was destroying lift, creating drag, and they took off in a low power setting.
Well, they take off and they're in a stall almost immediately. And a stall means the plane isn't flying, and the plane is not being lifted.
I knew we were in a swept wing stall and that we were inevitably going to crash.
The way you recover from a stall is add power to try to get airspeed, which helps, and you lower the nose, which also helps you regain your airspeed, and then you fly away. But you need altitude to do that, and they never had the altitude.
Basically, this plane just fell out of the sky.
At 4:01 p.m., just 20 seconds after liftoff, the Air Florida jet crashes into the south span of the 14th Street Bridge. The rooftops of some vehicles are sheared off by the plane's landing gear. 4 people on the bridge are killed, and 4 others injured. The nose of the plane pitches forward and slams into the Potomac River.
I've never hit anything that hard and that fast before. As I blacked out, I said, God help me. And I remember being sad because I knew it was my son's birthday, and I wasn't going to be around for any more of those.
Roger Olean is stuck in traffic when the plane crashes. He gets out of his car and races to the scene.
This is the span of the bridge that I was on, and I crossed all the way down until I was off the bridge. I ran down this bank until I reached approximately this point.
Lenny Skutnik arrives a few moments later.
We got out of our car up on the bridge there and made our way over to the guardrail here.
What they see below is horrific. There, sticking up from the icy water, is the twisted wreckage of the airplane's tail section. And in the tangled metal and ice are a few survivors. Coming up next on When Weather Changed History, the survivors of the Potomac crash fight for their lives.
A few minutes earlier, I'd been in this hot airplane, and all of a sudden I'm in a freezing river, and the airplane was gone.
January 13th, 1982, 4:01 p.m.
Palm 90, how you rate?
Palm 90 is the call sign for Air Florida Flight 90.
Palm 90, how do you rate?
The 737 jet has crashed, but less than a mile away at Washington National Airport. No one knows it yet.
Palm 90, contact departure control.
Air traffic controllers scramble to find the aircraft. Passenger Joe Stiley, knocked unconscious by the crash, is now shocked awake by the icy water.
I woke up, and I was sitting up in my seat, and the water was moving at about this speed up my face. And I remember doing this, and then then I was underwater. There were people moaning and groaning all around me.
All that's visible from the riverbank is the tail section of the plane, sticking out from the ice-choked river. Commuters who had been stuck in traffic make their way to the river's edge and see that there are a few survivors in the water. Once Roger Olean can see what happened, he doesn't pause to think.
I just really never stopped running. And I just kept running till I reached the bank of the river and I hopped in. I guess I was thinking, whether or not I could reach them, at least they would see something's being done.
Almost 5 miles away, at the U.S. Park Police Office, an emergency call comes in from National Airport that a plane has gone down. Pilot Don Usher and paramedic Gene Windsor quickly board their rescue helicopter and take off into the snowstorm.
When you looked up, there wasn't anything to see other than snow smacking you in the face. That's all you saw.
I said, Don, how are you flying this helicopter? Because all I could see at the front was snow. And he says, I follow roads. He was following the interstate that came into town, Interstate 395.
By now, local news crews are on the scene. The images they capture are horrifying and surreal. 6 people struggling in the icy Potomac River. Among them is a woman crying out for help. It is 22-year-old Priscilla Tirado, who had been on the plane with her husband and 2-month-old son.
She was out there splashing and yelling, "Where's my baby? Find my baby, I need my baby." And there wasn't any baby that I could see.
Along with Joe Stiley and Priscilla Tirado are Stiley's assistant Nikki Felch, businessman Bert Hamilton, and flight attendant Kelly Duncan.
We all just held on, and it snowed, and the snow was catching on my eyelashes and on my eyebrows, and and it was cold. And at some point, we said the Lord's Prayer.
All 5 were sitting near the back of the plane when it went down. They now cling to the floating wreckage. There is one more unidentified survivor behind the tail of the plane. All that's visible are his hands, clinging to the cold metal. He is still strapped in the plane, surrounded by twisted shards and cables.
He said, I can't move, I'm strapped in. He says, I can barely move my arms. And he says, I can't get loose.
The shifting wreckage and icy water prevent the other survivors from helping him. Joe Stiley looks up from the water and sees that onlookers have tossed makeshift rescue lines down from the bridge.
I thought about letting loose and floating down and catching one of those ropes or wires that people were dangling down. But I knew I couldn't do that because I couldn't do that with Priscilla and Nikki. So I figured the only real chance we had was to stick together.
At that moment, a helicopter arrives. It is the U.S. Park Police, with officers Gene Windsor and Don Usher. It is 4:22 p.m. Roger Olean has been in the water roughly 20 minutes trying to help the survivors. Now he moves back to shore and waves the chopper on to the crash victims.
I was just really cold. I was pretty tired. And I suppose I was hopeful in that the helicopter was there, so knowing that the best outcome that could possibly be would now happen. What that outcome was going to be, I didn't know. But I knew that this was the best chance that those people had for survival.
Pilot Don Usher uses his rotors to blow snow off the ice so he can see the survivors better. Once he gets a clear view, he recognizes a major challenge.
The area was absolutely just consumed in jet fuel. That was on the surface everywhere. Plus, we had people that had been in the water for obviously probably about 20 minutes at that point. So hypothermia was a big issue.
The chopper hovers just above the water. One of the survivors, Bert Hamilton, swims over and grabs onto one of the skids.
I told him, no, you can't do that. If we lifted that with him hanging on and dropped him, that would be horrible. And so I convinced him to take the rope and get it underneath of his arms, which he very well did. He was the first one out.
After delivering Hamilton to shore, the chopper crew goes back for the others. Nikki Felch with a yellow life preserver is close to Joe Stiley and Priscilla Tirado. The chopper drops a rope down, and stewardess Kelly Duncan grabs onto the dangling lifeline.
She did not get the rope all the way underneath of her arms. She just grabbed onto the rope and held on. And we delivered her to the shore just like that.
Emergency crews wrap Duncan in blankets and rush her to the ambulance. The rescuers hand Officer Gene Windsor another rope with a yellow life buoy attached. When the helicopter goes back out to get the others, the unidentified man passes off a lifeline. Joe Stiley struggles to get his arm through the ring buoy. Then another, second rope, drops from the helicopter. Nikki Felch finally grabs on. Joe holds on to Priscilla Tirado. At the same time, Joe tries to hang on to Nikki Felch.
And almost instantly, I just lost the grip on the back of Nikki's collar, which stressed me because obviously she was the one friend that I had when we started the day.
Pilot Don Usher drags all three people through the icy water. Nikki Felch is holding the rope with both hands, but she loses her grip. She can't hold on. Joe Stiley desperately tries to hang on to Priscilla Tirado as they're dragged through the water.
I kept running into ice, and the ice, I am guessing, was 6 to 8 inches thick. I got a lot of those right in my ribs. Eventually, I lost Priscilla. She just got juggled loose from me, hitting one of those ice packs.
Priscilla lands on a slab of ice. She tries to swim, calling out for help over and over. Joe is almost to shore, and the emergency crews continue to pull him onto the snowy bank. He tells his rescuers one thing.
I remember trying to tell the people that were pulling me out of the water that the remaining guy that's still in that airplane, you're gonna have to go in the water and cut him loose. He can't move and he can't get loose on his own.
Nikki Felch and Priscilla Tirado are also still out in the water. Priscilla is fighting, but by now, the jet fuel, shock, and frigid water are almost more than she can bear. Civilian Lenny Skutnik, who has been watching all of this from on shore, sees her desperation.
She's just laying there. She's waving her arms, and you can see her face is, just, it's awful.
Coming up, a daring rescue on When Weather Changed History. January 13th, 1982. A helicopter crew has rescued 3 survivors of the crash of Air Florida Flight 90. But 3 more are still in the icy Potomac River. One of the survivors, Priscilla Tirado, is groping on the ice, crying out for help. The chopper crew drops a life ring. But she appears to be going into shock, blinded by jet fuel. She struggles to grab hold of the buoy. Finally, Priscilla clings on, and the chopper slowly drags her towards shore. Her head is barely above the water, and moments later, her arm slips through the life ring. Civilian Lenny Skutnik is watching from the riverbank.
As soon as the arm comes out, I realize she's not going to make it. Something just hit me. It was another human being in very serious trouble. So I take my boots off and my coat, and I dive in after her.
Skutnik swims out to Priscilla just as her head is slipping beneath the surface.
And just as I get to her, her face is under the water. It's like one of those horror movies where you see somebody in a bathtub. Well, I just get her head above water and just start pushing and stroking. Get her close enough to the bank to a fireman who grabbed her.
Paramedics rush Priscilla Tirado to a waiting ambulance. The chopper crew returns for Nikki Felch. She can't grab the ring. Pilot Don Usher lowers the helicopter so far that the skid is actually under the water. Then Gene Windsor grabs Nikki. She struggles, but manages to throw a leg over his boot.
I pulled her up as far as I could get her. And I held on to her and I told Don, let's go.
After dropping off Felch, the chopper crew turns its attention to the 6th person in the water, the unidentified man, who was tangled up in the wreckage and had passed the rescue line on to others.
Went to the same spot, expected to see the same face with the hands holding onto the fuselage. There was nothing there. So we hovered around, we looked everywhere. The fuselage had sunk a little bit and turned a little bit.
The last survivor is gone. Don Usher and Gene Windsor fly over the wreckage for about 20 minutes, but find nothing. By 5 p.m., with darkness falling, the park police call off the helicopter search. In the days after the crash of Flight 90, an autopsy reveals the identity of the man who could not be saved. He is a bank examiner from Atlanta, 46-year-old Arland Williams. The wreckage of the plane, the wheels, fuselage, and tail section is reassembled.
They get all the pieces of the aircraft together, line them up approximately as the airplane should be assembled, and then start looking for things. A good engineer can tell an awful lot by looking at fractured pieces of metal.
As the investigation gets underway, the immediate focus is on the terrible weather. Investigators also focus on human performance in the snowstorm, how the pilots reacted in severe weather conditions.
If this crew just hadn't had that experience in their flying background, it's reasonable that they just didn't know what they were dealing with.
These suspicions are confirmed when investigators analyze the so-called black boxes, which are actually orange and contain the cockpit voice recorder. In examining the tape, investigators realized the crew underestimated the severity of ice buildup on the wings of the aircraft.
They could see that other airplanes were being contaminated with ice, and for some reason it just didn't register with them that they were getting in a very dangerous situation.
As the plane taxied for takeoff, the co-pilot, Roger Pettit, expressed doubt that the de-icing of the plane was really effective.
This is a loose valve here on trying to de-ice things. That gives you a false feeling of security, that's all it is.
The danger may have been compounded when the pilot had earlier used his reverse thrust to try to back out of the gate. Such a move would kick up slush, possibly blocking engine sensors. Investigators also discover that a key engine sensor was frozen. They determined that the pilots neglected to turn on the engine's anti-ice system, which keeps the sensors from freezing.
The engine anti-ice was not turned on, and that meant that the sensors provided incorrect engine readings to the cockpit because they were iced over.
It is not until they're accelerating down the runway that the first officer and co-pilot, Roger Pettit, realizes there's a problem and mentions it to the pilot, Larry Wheaton.
With the question the first officer raised several times, 4 times with the captain, things don't look right.
There's 80, refers to an appropriate acceleration reading of 80 knots. But co-pilot Pettit questions it.
There was clearly a question in his mind, and the captain did not respond by aborting.
The captain thought he had enough power for takeoff, but the cockpit tape reveals otherwise.
In this case, we could pick up a frequency coming from the engines. We can figure out how fast the engine is turning.
As Flight 90 took off, the co-pilot's suspicions were correct. The engines weren't providing enough power. Cockpit gauges showed a false high reading. The pilot finally realizes it as he desperately tries to control the plane. After a 7-month investigation, the National Transportation Safety Board issues its final report on the crash of Flight 90. And the aviation industry makes some sweeping changes. That's next in the conclusion of When Weather Changed History. Seven months after an Air Florida Boeing 737 crashes into the Potomac River, investigators release their official report. Among the findings, bad weather on that frigid day in January 1982 contributed to the accident. But the probable cause was a series of mistakes made by the pilot and co-pilot.
The crew just didn't grasp the seriousness of the situation. They were accumulating ice on the wing, and they just weren't reacting properly.
In its report, the National Transportation Safety Board noted the limited experience of the flight crew in winter operations. Among the pilot's errors, the failure to use the engine anti-ice system and the prolonged delay between de-icing and takeoff. Before takeoff, the plane sat on the tarmac for nearly an hour, allowing snow and ice to build up on the wings. After the crash, the airline industry adopts many changes recommended by the NTSB. Now, an aircraft must be de-iced closer to the time of takeoff, and planes are not allowed to sit in the snow for so long without being de-iced again.
You'll find the de-icing trucks now are frequently at the end of the runway, so it's the last thing you get before you're cleared for takeoff.
Airfare wars took a toll on Air Florida, forcing it into bankruptcy in 1984. 2 weeks after the crash, during his State of the Union address, President Ronald Reagan paid tribute to civilian rescuer Lenny Skutnik, who jumped into the river to help save Priscilla Tirado.
In the midst of a terrible tragedy on the Potomac, we saw again the spirit of American heroism at its finest.
It kind of stunned me. I really, to this day, don't think it was that big of a deal. I don't think of myself as a hero. I'm just a human being.
The Coast Guard honored civilian Roger Olean for his bravery. He jumped into the frigid water and stayed there for more than 20 minutes, trying to help the crash victims.
One thing that I did have a chance at was showing them that somebody was coming. It's the forces of nature, probably that's the greatest adversary that people will ever contend with. And even against that, maybe we can't prevail, but if we work together, we can make a difference.
Rescued passenger Joe Stiley left the hospital in the spring of 1982. He never fully recovered from his injuries, but he is thankful for every day he's lived since the crash of Flight 90.
I'm reminded about it when I hurt, and I hurt all the time, but sometimes the hurt, is more acute. Every time January 13th comes around, I'm quite aware that it's my son's birthday and it's an anniversary of that trauma. But my feelings are joy for being here for another birthday.